What if I told you that some of America's most powerful leaders hid dark secrets they never wanted the world to know? Corruption, betrayals, secret affairs, even backroom deals with the Mafia. These aren't just wild conspiracy theories. From a president who sabotaged peace to win an election, to another whose secret love child was covered up for decades, history is filled with shocking truths that were buried deep. Until now. This isn't the history they teach in school. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see these presidents forever. Thomas Jefferson and the Sally Hemings controversy. Thomas Jefferson, one of the most revered founding fathers of the United States, was known for penning the Declaration of Independence and serving as the third president of the country. He championed the ideals of liberty, democracy, and individual rights. However, his legacy is marred by a deep contradiction. While he advocated for the equality of all men, he was a lifelong slave owner. Among his many dark secrets, none is as controversial and widely debated as his relationship with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman at Monticello. For years, historians and Jefferson's admirers either dismissed or attempted to obscure this part of his life. But modern DNA evidence and historical records have shed light on an unsettling truth. Jefferson almost certainly fathered multiple children with Hemings, who was decades younger than him and had no freedom to refuse his advances. Sally Hemings was born into slavery and was the half-sister of Jefferson's wife, Martha. This was because Sally's mother, Betty Hemings, was of mixed race and had been the concubine of John Wales, Jefferson's father-in-law. This made Sally three-quarters European by ancestry, with strikingly light skin. When Martha Jefferson died in 1782, Thomas Jefferson was devastated and vowed never to remarry. Shortly after, he was appointed as the U.S. minister to France, and he took his eldest daughter with him. Sally Hemings, then just a teenager, accompanied them to France, where slavery was illegal. While in France, Sally had more rights than she did in Virginia and could have pursued her freedom, but she returned with Jefferson to Monticello under circumstances that suggest she may have been pressured or promised certain conditions in exchange. By the time she returned to Monticello, she was pregnant with Jefferson's child. According to records and later accounts from her son, Madison Hemings, she bore at least 6 of Jefferson's children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. These children were granted informal privileges that were uncommon for enslaved people at the time. They were allowed to work inside the house rather than in the fields, received some education, and were later quietly freed. Unlike other enslaved individuals at Monticello, none of Sally's children were sold, a stark contrast to Jefferson's usual practice of selling or trading slaves to pay off his mounting debts. The fact that they were freed suggests an unspoken acknowledgement of their paternity. For years, Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings was dismissed as mere rumor, a slanderous attack by his political enemies. The controversy first gained traction during Jefferson's presidency when a journalist named James Callender, whom Jefferson had once hired to attack his rivals, turned on him and published accusations of his relationship with Hemings. Jefferson never publicly addressed these claims, but he also never outright denied them. His family and many historians throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries vehemently defended his reputation, dismissing the accusations as baseless. However, oral histories from the Hemings family persisted, recounting how their ancestors were direct descendants of Jefferson himself. In 1998, scientific advancements finally provided evidence that Jefferson's white descendants had long tried to refute. DNA testing conducted by researchers established a genetic link between the Jefferson male line and Sally Hemings' descendants, proving that Jefferson or one of his close male relatives had fathered her children. Given that no other Jefferson male was documented to have been at Monticello during the time her children were conceived, the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to Thomas Jefferson himself. This revelation forced historians to reevaluate Jefferson's legacy, confronting the uncomfortable reality that a man who wrote about liberty and human rights also engaged in the subjugation of those he considered inferior. The nature of Jefferson's relationship with Hemings remains deeply troubling. Sally was enslaved, meaning she had no legal right to refuse his advances or to live independently. She was at least 30 years younger than Jefferson, raising serious ethical concerns about coercion and power imbalance. Unlike Jefferson's relationship with his wife, which was built on choice, his relationship with Hemings existed within the constraints of slavery, where consent was inherently impossible. The historical romanticization of their relationship, often suggesting that Hemings was his mistress in a consensual manner, ignores the brutal realities of the time. She was his property, and their dynamic was one of control rather than equal partnership. Despite the evidence, Jefferson's legacy remains complicated. His contributions to American democracy, particularly in shaping its founding ideals, are undeniable. Yet his actions regarding slavery and his personal life reflect the hypocrisy that pervaded the early years of the Republic. The same man who wrote that all men are created equal denied freedom to hundreds of enslaved individuals, including his own children. He even advocated for the gradual abolition of slavery in public discourse while continuing to profit from it privately. His refusal to free his slaves during his lifetime, except for a select few of the Hemings family, suggests that his personal interests ultimately outweighed his philosophical beliefs. In the 21st century, the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings has been increasingly recognized as an integral part of American history. Monticello, once reluctant to acknowledge this part of Jefferson's life, has since included Hemings in its historical narratives, honoring her story and the lives of those enslaved at Jefferson's estate. Her descendants, who were once denied recognition by Jefferson's white heirs, now have their lineage acknowledged as part of the Jefferson family tree. The truth about Jefferson and Hemings serves as a stark reminder that history is rarely as noble and straightforward as it is often presented. The story forces Americans to grapple with the contradictions of their founding fathers, men who fought for freedom while simultaneously denying it to others. Jefferson's hidden relationship with Sally Hemings is a testament to the enduring impact of slavery, power imbalances, and historical erasure, making it one of the most significant and unsettling aspects of early American history. Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears. Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, is often remembered as a war hero and the champion of the common man. His presidency marked the rise of Jacksonian democracy, where he positioned himself as the defender of the people against corrupt elites. However, his legacy is also stained by one of the darkest chapters in American history, the forced removal of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands, known as the Trail of Tears. While Jackson framed his Indian removal policy as a necessary step for progress, it was, in reality, an act of ethnic cleansing that led to the suffering and death of thousands of indigenous people. This dark secret, long whitewashed by supporters of his legacy, reveals the brutal reality of his administration's policies. Before becoming president, Jackson had already established himself as a ruthless force against Native American tribes. As a military general, he led brutal campaigns against the Creek and Seminole people, seizing their lands and destroying their communities. His victory at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814 resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Creek warriors and the forced cession of millions of acres of tribal land to the United States. He viewed Native Americans as obstacles to American expansion and believed they should either assimilate into white society or be removed entirely. His actions in Florida, where he waged war against the Seminole tribe, further demonstrated his commitment to aggressive expansionism, even when it meant defying international law by attacking Spanish-controlled territory. When Jackson became president in 1829, he made Indian removal one of his top priorities. At the time, several Native American tribes, including the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole, lived on valuable land in the southeastern United States, particularly in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. White settlers, eager to expand cotton plantations, pressured the government to take these lands. Jackson, who had personally benefited from land acquisitions in his military career, fully supported these demands. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act into law, granting the federal government the power to negotiate treaties forcing Native Americans to relocate west of the Mississippi River, while Jackson and his supporters claimed that removal was a benevolent policy meant to protect Native Americans from white encroachment. The reality was far different. Many tribes resisted, particularly the Cherokee, who had adapted to American society by adopting European-style farming, government, and even slavery. They took their case to the Supreme Court in Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, where Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political entity with sovereignty over its land. Jackson, however, ignored the ruling, allegedly stating, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." His defiance of the Supreme Court was an unprecedented abuse of power and set the stage for one of the most inhumane policies in U.S. history. By 1838, after years of pressure and fraudulent treaties, the U.S. government began forcibly removing Native Americans from their lands. The Cherokee were rounded up by soldiers, often at gunpoint, and herded into makeshift detention camps before being forced to march over 1,000 miles to present-day Oklahoma. This brutal journey, later named the Trail of Tears, saw thousands of Cherokee men, women, and children die from disease, starvation, and exposure. Historians estimate that nearly a quarter of the Cherokee population perished along the way. Other tribes, such as the Choctaw and Creek, suffered similar fates. The U.S. government provided little to no assistance, and many Native Americans were forced to walk barefoot in freezing conditions, leaving a trail of bodies along the path westward. Jackson, however, showed little remorse for the suffering he had inflicted. He justified the removals by claiming they were necessary for progress and that Native Americans would thrive in their new territory. In reality, their forced relocation shattered communities, destroyed cultures, and marked the beginning of decades of oppression under the U.S. government. The land they were moved to was often barren and unsuitable for farming, and many tribes struggled to rebuild their lives. Meanwhile, the lands they left behind were quickly seized by white settlers, fulfilling Jackson's vision of westward expansion at the cost of native lives. While Jackson left office in 1837, before the full extent of the Trail of Tears unfolded, his policies set it in motion. His successor, Martin Van Buren, carried out the final removals, but the responsibility for the suffering ultimately lay with Jackson. Despite the horror of these events, Jackson remained unapologetic until his death. He saw himself as a defender of American interests, even when those interests came at the expense of an entire people. His supporters, both in his time and in later generations, portrayed him as a strong and decisive leader, often omitting the devastating impact of his policies on Native Americans. Jackson's legacy remains controversial today. While he is celebrated for his military victories and his role in expanding democracy for white men, the darker side of his presidency is impossible to ignore. His actions set a precedent for the U.S. government's long history of broken treaties and mistreatment of Native American nations. The Trail of Tears stands as a haunting reminder of how the pursuit of expansion and economic gain often came at the cost of human suffering. In recent years, the debate over Jackson's place in American history has intensified. His image was long glorified on the $20 bill, but efforts to replace him with Harriet Tubman reflect a growing acknowledgement of his atrocities. Historians have increasingly recognized the Trail of Tears as an act of ethnic cleansing, and Jackson's reputation has been reevaluated in light of the immense pain he inflicted. Yet his defenders continue to argue that he was simply a product of his time, a leader who did what was necessary for the nation's growth. The truth about Andrew Jackson is not one of heroism, but of cruelty masked as progress. His role in the Trail of Tears is one of the darkest secrets in U.S. presidential history, one that exposes the deep contradictions in America's founding principles of freedom and justice. His story forces Americans to confront the uncomfortable reality that the nation's expansion was built not only on ambition and innovation, but also on the suffering and displacement of those who stood in its way. The legacy of Jackson's policies still lingers today, as Native American communities continue to fight for recognition, land rights, and justice in a country that once sought to erase them. Warren G. Harding, the Teapot Dome. Scandal and illicit affairs. Warren G. Harding, the 29th President of the United States, was often seen as a charming and affable leader, but behind the facade of his easygoing nature lay a presidency rife with corruption, scandal, and personal indiscretions. Though he presented himself as a man of the people, his administration was deeply entangled in bribery and cronyism, with one of the worst financial scandals in American history unfolding under his watch, the infamous Teapot Dome scandal. But Harding's dark secrets were not limited to political corruption. His personal life was just as scandalous, filled with extramarital affairs, illegitimate children, and rumors of secret love letters. For years, his supporters and family attempted to suppress these revelations, but history has since uncovered the truth about his tainted legacy. Harding entered the presidency in 1921 as a popular choice, largely due to his promise of a return to normalcy following the upheaval of World War I. However, his lack of strong leadership and reliance on his close circle of friends, later called the Ohio Gang, proved disastrous. These men, whom Harding trusted deeply, used their positions in government to enrich themselves through corruption and backroom deals. Harding himself seemed either unaware or unwilling to confront the rot within his administration, preferring to spend his time playing poker, drinking, despite prohibition, and indulging in affairs rather than governing. The most notorious scandal of his presidency was the Teapot Dome scandal, a case of political corruption that shook the nation. It involved the illegal leasing of federal oil reserves to private companies in exchange for bribes. The scandal centered around Albert B. Fall, Harding's Secretary of the Interior, who secretly leased oil-rich government lands in Teapot Dome, Wyoming and Elk Hills, California, to private oil companies. In return, Fall received bribes totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, an astronomical sum at the time. When the scandal broke, it was one of the biggest political scandals in U.S. history, leading to Fall becoming the first ever U.S. cabinet member to be convicted of a crime and sent to prison. Though Harding himself was not directly implicated in taking bribes, his failure to oversee his corrupt administration and his close ties to the men involved severely damaged his reputation. Beyond the political turmoil, Harding's personal life was equally scandalous. He was a notorious womanizer, engaging in multiple extramarital affairs even before he entered the White House. One of his most infamous relationships was with Nan Britton, a woman 30 years his junior who claimed that Harding fathered her daughter, Elizabeth Ann. Britton later wrote a tell-all book, The President's Daughter, where she detailed their secret meetings, often conducted in the White House itself. According to Britton, Harding would arrange clandestine encounters, sometimes even in a closet near the Oval Office, while his wife, First Lady Florence Harding, remained oblivious or turned a blind eye. At the time, the Republican establishment and Harding's defenders dismissed Britton's claims, accusing her of fabricating the story for money. However, decades later, DNA testing confirmed that Harding was indeed the father of Britton's child, vindicating her account and solidifying Harding's reputation as an unfaithful husband with a reckless personal life. Another affair that caused controversy was his long-standing relationship with Carrie Fulton Phillips, the wife of one of his friends. Phillips not only had a deep romantic connection with Harding, but she also blackmailed him for years, threatening to expose their affair unless he provided her with financial support. Their passionate relationship was revealed through a trove of explicit love letters that Harding wrote to her, letters so steamy and revealing that the Library of Congress kept them sealed for decades before finally releasing them to the public. In these letters, Harding referred to himself as Jerry and expressed deep romantic and sexual longing for Phillips. These writings not only confirmed his unfaithfulness, but also painted a picture of a man who was reckless in both his personal and political dealings. Despite the growing scandals surrounding him, Harding never lived to see the full extent of the damage to his reputation. In 1923, while on a trip to the West Coast, he mysteriously died in a San Francisco hotel room. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack or stroke, but rumors of foul play quickly spread. Some suspected that his wife, Florence Harding, who had long been aware of his infidelities, may have poisoned him to prevent further humiliation. Others speculated that the stress of the scandals and the betrayal of his closest allies had taken a fatal toll on his health. No autopsy was ever performed, leaving the exact cause of death a mystery. After his death, efforts were made to protect Harding's image. His wife destroyed many of his personal papers, likely in an attempt to erase evidence of his affairs and misconduct. His political allies also worked to downplay the scandals, portraying Harding as a well-meaning but naive leader who was taken advantage of by corrupt associates. However, history has not been kind to Harding. As more evidence emerged over the years, he became widely regarded as one of the worst presidents in U.S. history, his tenure marked by incompetence, corruption, and personal excess. While Harding's administration did achieve some economic successes and initiated progressive policies in civil rights, these accomplishments were overshadowed by the rampant corruption and moral failures that defined his presidency. His reckless personal behavior, combined with his inability to control the corruption within his own administration, makes his tenure one of the most scandal-ridden in American history. The story of Warren G. Harding serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and political complacency. His legacy is not one of great leadership, but of what happens when a leader prioritizes personal pleasure and cronyism over the responsibilities of the office. His presidency remains a reminder that even the highest office in the land is not immune to scandal, corruption, and human weakness. John F. Kennedy, Mafia ties and hidden health issues. John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, is often remembered as a charismatic leader who inspired a generation with his vision of progress, space exploration, and civil rights. His assassination in 1963 cemented his status as an American icon, with many viewing him as a martyr for the country's future. However, behind the carefully curated image of youthful energy and idealism, Kennedy's life was riddled with dark secrets that his family and political allies worked tirelessly to conceal. From deep ties to organized crime to his severe health issues and reckless personal affairs, JFK's legacy is far more complicated than the public was led to believe. One of the most enduring and controversial aspects of Kennedy's presidency is his alleged connection to the Mafia. His rise to power was not solely the result of his charm or political skills. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy, was a powerful and ruthless businessman with strong connections to organized crime figures. During Prohibition, Joseph Kennedy was rumored to have made part of his fortune smuggling illegal alcohol, forging relationships with figures like Sam Giancana, a Chicago mob boss. When JFK ran for president in 1960, these underworld connections allegedly played a key role in his narrow victory. Evidence suggests that the Chicago Mafia helped deliver crucial votes for Kennedy in Illinois, particularly in Cook County, where election results were suspiciously favorable for him. In exchange, the mob expected protection and political favors from the new administration. However, once JFK took office, his brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, launched an aggressive campaign against organized crime, ordering investigations into the very men who had helped put JFK in the White House. This move angered mob bosses who saw it as a betrayal, leading to speculation that the Mafia may have played a role in JFK's eventual assassination. Some theories suggest that mob leaders, enraged by the Kennedy administration's crackdown, either collaborated with or turned a blind eye to plots against the president. Aside from his Mafia connections, JFK also had numerous extramarital affairs, including one with Judith Exner, who had close ties to Sam Giancana. Exner later claimed she acted as a go-between for Kennedy and the mob boss, raising further concerns about the depth of his underworld connections. Other affairs included Hollywood star Marilyn Monroe, whose tragic and mysterious death in 1962 only fueled speculation about the Kennedy family's influence in silencing those who knew too much. FBI files revealed that Monroe had been under surveillance due to her associations with JFK and his brother Robert, leading many to believe that she was either murdered or pressured into silence to protect the administration. While JFK's reckless personal behavior was risky enough, his severe health issues were an even greater hidden danger. Despite his public image as a young athletic leader, Kennedy suffered from numerous chronic health conditions, most notably Addison's disease, a life-threatening disorder that affects the adrenal glands. This condition made him highly dependent on a cocktail of medications, including steroids, amphetamines, and painkillers. Kennedy's medical problems began early. As a child, he was frequently sick and suffered from colitis, ulcers, and persistent back pain. His war injuries from World War II exacerbated his back problems, leading him to undergo multiple failed surgeries that only worsened his condition. By the time he reached the presidency, he was heavily medicated, often receiving injections from Dr. Max Jacobson, known as Dr. Feelgood, who provided a mix of amphetamines and other stimulants to high-profile clients. These drugs helped JFK appear energetic and confident in public, but may have also affected his judgment and decision-making. His health problems were so severe that doctors believed he might not survive a full presidential term. He wore a back brace most of the time, which, according to some historians, may have contributed to his death. When he was shot in Dallas, the brace prevented him from slumping forward, making him an easier target for the second fatal shot. Despite all these issues, Kennedy's medical records were carefully concealed from the public. Had the American people known the extent of his illnesses, it is unlikely he would have been elected, as many would have questioned his ability to lead. Even after his death, his family continued to suppress information about his health, maintaining the illusion of a vigorous and youthful leader. The combination of Kennedy's Mafia ties, reckless personal life, and hidden illnesses paints a far more complex picture of his presidency than the idealized version often portrayed in history books. While he undoubtedly left a lasting impact on the country, his secret dealings and personal vulnerabilities reveal the fragility of his leadership. His story serves as a reminder that even the most beloved figures in history often have hidden truths lurking beneath the surface, shaping their legacies in ways the public was never meant to know. Richard Nixon, Watergate and Political Sabotage. Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, is most infamously remembered for the Watergate scandal, which led to his resignation in 1974. However, Watergate was just one piece of a much larger pattern of deception, manipulation, and political sabotage that defined Nixon's career. His presidency was riddled with covert operations, abuse of power, and a deep paranoia that drove him to commit acts of corruption far beyond what the public knew at the time. While he attempted to present himself as a champion of law and order, behind the scenes, Nixon orchestrated some of the most unethical political maneuvers in American history. One of Nixon's darkest secrets was that he sabotaged peace talks during the Vietnam War in order to win the 1968 presidential election. During that time, the U.S. was deeply entrenched in Vietnam, and President Lyndon B. Johnson was working on peace negotiations with North Vietnam. However, Nixon, fearing that a successful peace deal would benefit his opponent, Hubert Humphrey, engaged in secret back-channel communications to derail the talks. Through an intermediary, Anna Chennault, Nixon sent messages to the South Vietnamese government, urging them to refuse a peace deal until after the election, implying that they would get a better agreement under his presidency. This act of political sabotage, known as the Chennault Affair, prolonged the Vietnam War, leading to thousands more American and Vietnamese deaths. While Johnson was aware of Nixon's actions through FBI surveillance, he chose not to reveal the evidence publicly, fearing it would shake the country's trust in democracy. Nixon went on to win the presidency, but his hands were already stained with the blood of those who perished in a war he secretly prolonged for political gain. Once in office, Nixon's paranoia and obsession with control led to a pattern of spying on political opponents and suppressing dissent. One of his most infamous operations was COINTELPRO, a program originally started by the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, but embraced by Nixon to monitor, infiltrate, and sabotage civil rights activists, anti-war protesters, and political opponents. Under Nixon, the FBI and CIA engaged in illegal surveillance, wiretapping, and even blackmail to undermine perceived enemies, including figures like Martin Luther King Jr., journalists, and Democratic politicians. His paranoia also led to the creation of the Enemies List, a secret document detailing individuals and groups that Nixon viewed as threats to his administration. These people, ranging from politicians to reporters, were targeted with IRS audits, smear campaigns, and surveillance. Among those on the list were Senator Ted Kennedy, journalist Daniel Schorr, and actor Paul Newman, all of whom had been vocal critics of Nixon's policies. His administration worked behind the scenes to ruin reputations and discredit anyone who stood in his way. This culture of secrecy and dirty politics ultimately culminated in the Watergate scandal, the event that would forever tarnish Nixon's legacy. In June 1972, a group of operatives known as the Plumbers, working under Nixon's direction, broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. Their goal was to install wiretaps and gather intelligence to help Nixon's re-election campaign. However, the burglars were caught, and what initially seemed like a minor crime quickly unraveled into a massive cover-up that reached the highest levels of government. Nixon, desperate to conceal his involvement, ordered his staff to obstruct the investigation, offering hush money to the burglars and instructing the CIA to pressure the FBI into dropping the case. However, as investigative journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein dug deeper, and as White House insiders like John Dean began testifying, the truth became impossible to hide. The smoking gun was a series of secret recordings Nixon had made of his conversations in the Oval Office, which ultimately proved that he had not only known about the break-in, but had actively worked to cover it up. As impeachment loomed, Nixon finally resigned in August 1974, becoming the first and only U.S. president to do so. His successor, Gerald Ford, controversially pardoned him for any crimes he had committed, ensuring that Nixon would never face legal consequences for his actions. The pardon sparked national outrage, as many believed Nixon should have been held accountable for abusing his power. Beyond Watergate, Nixon also engaged in unethical foreign policy maneuvers, including prolonging the Vietnam War even after winning re-election in 1972. Though he eventually withdrew U.S. troops in 1973, his administration secretly expanded the war into Cambodia and Laos, conducting bombings without congressional approval. These bombings destabilized the region and contributed to the rise of the brutal Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, which would go on to commit genocide. Despite these scandals, Nixon attempted to rehabilitate his image in later years, emphasizing his accomplishments such as opening diplomatic relations with China and his environmental policies. However, history has not absolved him. His presidency remains one of the most corrupt in American history, with his legacy serving as a warning about the dangers of unchecked presidential power. Nixon's dark secrets, his sabotage of the Vietnam peace talks, his use of federal agencies for personal revenge, and his orchestration of Watergate paint a portrait of a leader consumed by ambition, paranoia, and an insatiable need for control. His story is a reminder that even the most powerful figures can fall when their deception is exposed, and that democracy depends on the vigilance of those willing to hold leaders accountable.